Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Two World Podcast. I have the honor of starting us off today. I am Barney, and I am joined with my co-host,
Jacob.
And today we are joined with by a very special guest today. I started my collegiate career at Marquette University. We referenced that a few episodes back, and I was actually studying biochemistry at the time. Looking to go into pharmaceuticals. And either that major wasn't for me or the school wasn't for me or a little bit of both. And I ended up transferring to Goshen College. And aside from talking to the president on the telephone before I arrived there, I think the first person that I met in person is today's guest. And it's a little bit sad to realize that he will be retiring from his position. But he has certainly graced a number of students' lives, myself included, even though maybe we didn't have so many classes together, just we're going to such a small school and me working in the library, I had the chance to meet today's guest almost every day, it felt. And I really credit him for helping me to become a better scholar, and especially for seeing that in the case of history, imagination plays such a huge role in how we look at the texts, how we fill in the gaps, and how we see ourselves maybe even connected with our role in history and how we see it. And our guest today, I'll let him introduce himself, is
John Roth, professor of history at Goshen College here in Northern Indiana.
And it's just, I just am so thankful to have him on the show. For a few months now, I kept thinking, wouldn't it be so neat? Wouldn't it be so neat? Wouldn't it just be so neat if I could get John Roth on the show? And I thought, no, he's just way too busy. It's just impossible. And just like we had talked to each other the day before, he's like, oh yeah, sure, I'll be on your show. I don't mind. And, and we got it to work out, and it's just wonderful. Of course, our show here, we often like to look at the two world. We like to look at kind of interesting spaces that we see faith in. And as John is a history scholar, and I thought maybe it's a good chance to maybe think about how maybe scholarship and study can impact or influence our faith. Maybe some examples. I'll go first while you guys think about it maybe. When I have two stories from high school. I remember learning about and being fascinated with the Habsburgs in high school in history. And especially one person was, I think he was a Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And one thing that really appealed to me so much was that he abdicated the throne and ended up living in a monastery at the end of his life. And I just, as the high school me, who wasn't so studious, thought, boy, that's amazing. You know, he's the Holy Roman Emperor, and then he goes to a monastery to hopefully, in my image, to live out his faith. And I don't necessarily know that ended up being true. And maybe hearkening back to our past episode about heroes, if I dug a little deeper, I might have my opinion changed. But also from high school, in math class of all things, I ran into something called the Fibonacci Sequence, which is, I guess it's a sequence, it's a ratio that talks about a number of things that happen in nature. And it made me realize that this kind of thing doesn't happen by accident. And that really kind of, I guess it really affected my faith. It really made me think that of all the things that we try to understand through science and study and analysis, there are just these mysteries that sometimes are right in front of our faces that we can't explain in any other way than through our lens of faith. And I'm curious to hear if both of you or either of you have kind of a similar experience, or how maybe your scholarship and your study has impacted or had even a little impact on your faith in your lives.
Sure. It's interesting to hear a little bit more of your story, Barney. I had forgotten that you started out in the sciences and then found your life taking a different direction, because it's quite similar to my own experience. I assumed when I came to Goshen College in the fall of 1977 that I was going to be in the sciences and follow in my father's. My father was a country doctor, and I admired what he did, and I thought it would be appropriate to become a doctor and to go back and take over his practice. But it seemed to fit with a religious context that I grew up in, that if you were going to go on to education, it should be something like teaching or social work or nursing or medicine that was service. And when I found myself through a strange set of circumstances captivated by the study of history, it seemed to almost pose a problem for me, because in the religious worldview that I grew up in, nobody actually said this, but I had the sense that things like poetry, literature, history were not really serious vocations for the Christian. They were not bad things, but they didn't fit in with the life of service in the classic sense. And it took me a while to truly believe that as a historian, I was connected in a deep and meaningful way with my personal faith and the faith tradition that I grew up in. But it took a while. I remember as a young scholar, as a young faculty person, I was invited to an event at Calvin College, which is in Grand Rapids, close to Goshen. And in that Reformed tradition, they have a very high view of the life of the mind. And I remember early in my teaching career being at a table in which somebody prayed and thanked God for the gift of the mind and the gift of reason and the opportunity to use your mind in the service of God. And I remember crying. Just it came as such a shock. I was just sort of overwhelmed with the idea that history, scholarship really could be connected in a deep way with faith. And it wasn't like my tradition was antagonistic to scholarship. It never was honored. It never was explicitly named in that way. And I have been really fortunate to see the possibilities and opportunities of thinking about my vocation as scholarship for the church. And that's really how I've come just to see my work over the last 36 years now at Goshen College.
And following up on that, was it kind of serendipitous that you ended up studying so much into, Anabaptist history and, writing as you did about the Mennonites? Or was that also that you kind of felt kind of compelled? Was that kind of your background kind of tugging you along in that direction?
Yeah, at the time, nothing seems linear. The clarity only emerges in retrospect when you look back on your life and you see, okay, this led to that. But when I graduated I was an undergraduate at Goshen. I did my undergraduate work at Goshen College. when I graduated in 1981, and was clear that I wanted to pursue history in graduate work, I was also pretty clear that I didn't want to be a historian of the Mennonites or Anabaptism. And so when I went to the University of Chicago, I became a student of early modern European history, German social history of the 18th and 19th century. So my dissertation had nothing to do with Mennonites. And when I finished the dissertation, I was eager to move into, a position at a research university. And it was a very difficult decision at the time to come to Goshen as opposed to some other opportunities at, I suppose, a more traditional career as a historian at a Division I university. And I owe a lot of that to the wisdom of my good wife, who asked questions like, where do we want to raise a family? Where do we have a community? Where do we have a congregation that we could imagine being part of that we could embed ourselves in? And she was pretty clear that of the options we were looking at, Goshen was a better place. And, I look back now and say, thank God, because this has been such a gift in terms of the opportunities it afforded and the paths that have opened up here. But it was not a foregone conclusion. And in fact, I was initially somewhat resistant to settling for Goshen at the time.
One of the things that I find really interesting that you mentioned earlier is your awakening to this idea of the intellect being a big part of your journey or of your spirituality through the contact with your Reformed brothers and sisters. And I'm kind of wondering how those types of experiences, being around Christians of other traditions, have informed your vision for your work, what you want to do, what you want to prioritize. I just got the sense from that story that it was a huge blessing for you to see another form of spirituality and meet Christians from another tradition. It gave you new insight and understanding. And I'm kind of wondering, has that continued to play out in your life in various ways as you've worked alongside other Christians?
Yeah, it's a good question. And again, the clarity comes later because it wasn't always obvious to me that there were theological riches to be discovered in other traditions. When we settled at Goshen, very quickly, part of the job description here included serving as director of really the world's most comprehensive collection of Anabaptist, Mennonite, Hutterite, Amish print material, the Mennonite Historical Library, that had been established almost a century earlier, and was a remarkable research level collection focused on the Radical Reformation and the groups that emerged out of the Radical Reformation. And so I became the director of that library, and then shortly after that, editor of a journal called the Mennonite Quarterly Review. And it quickly became clear that I needed to retool as a historian of the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition, that was part of what it meant to be at Goshen. And I threw myself into that with both a an intellectual and a spiritual enthusiasm. I wasn't always clear that I wanted to be a Mennonite in some of my earlier years. And yet I really had a charmed childhood. I had loving parents. There was nothing really to react against in my, it was a conservative upbringing in many ways. I was keenly aware that I was part of this community, a distinct community, but it was not oppressive in the sense that I needed to reject it. And so in the early 1990s, late 80s and early 90s, as I settled into my work at Goshen, I became really, I would say, deeply grounded and committed in the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition as a historian, but also fairly early on, I would be invited to speak at conferences, academic conferences, but also regional church gatherings. And then in many, many congregations, trying to think about what renewal of the church would look like from a historical perspective. And I found kind of my voice in that. And I became, I would say, a champion of Anabaptist Mennonite identity. And so in the late 1990s, when the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the ELCA, came to Mennonite Church USA, it was just becoming Mennonite Church USA, and asked to enter into ecumenical dialogue. And the focus there initially was on something called the Augsburg Confession, a confession of faith in the Lutheran tradition that goes back to 1530, that is their authoritative confession. And the confession includes some condemnations of the Anabaptists. 5 different places where that confession says we condemn the Anabaptists who teach. And the condemnations in the 16th century context were not just theological condemnations, they were also juridical condemnations. And they were associated then with the justification of martyrdom, of persecution, which was also a story that I was, that seemed important to keep alive, to tell the story of ancestors who suffered for their faith, spiritual ancestors who suffered for their faith, and that discipleship can be costly. So that was all part of my worldview. And when the ELCA came to the Mennonites saying, we want to talk about the condemnations, and I was asked to be part of that dialogue team, I went into that as a missionary. I went into it with a sense that we were this tiny little group. Lutheran textbooks for many years called the Anabaptist tradition the deformation of the Reformation. And that rankled me. And I was, we'd been overlooked in the history of the church. And now they were coming penitently, looking for help with how to deal with these condemnations in the confession. And I went with an edge. I went into those conversations ready to scold a little bit and to, and I experienced, to my surprise, I've called it a conversion. I mean, I've had more than one conversion. It's those sort of moments where something happens that you suddenly you see the world in a different way, and you have to think about assumptions that seemed clear in a new way. And I experienced in the ELCA, a sense of urgency about the brokenness of the body of Christ. Up until that point, it never occurred to me that divisions in the Christian church were a theological problem. I just assumed, well, that's just the way it is. They're just these are inevitable. And my conversation partners came into the conversation saying, no, this is a problem, and it's a high priority for us as a denomination to overcome these divisions, and that's why we're in this room. And I experienced ecumenical hospitality, a kind of vulnerability on their side that shook me, that forced me to rethink the tenacious way that I was holding on to the particularity of the Anabaptist identity. You know, we weren't just distinct, we were unique. And we were neither Catholic nor Protestant. There was a popular book that shaped my view that came out in the 70s called Anabaptism, Neither Catholic nor Protestant. And it captured so well that sense of you define yourself by who you are not. And I recognized that impulse of we needed to have enemies in order to know who we were. And I saw that impulse playing itself out in my own tradition. All of the divisions that have been part of the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition, of groups whose sense of holiness, whose sense of being right with God depends on defining yourself over against someone who is less holy or who is not. And that hit me in these conversations with the ELCA, and it put me on a journey of rethinking theological and historical identity, how I was telling the Anabaptist story. And I'm been part of ecumenical conversations ever since, and deeply grateful for that reorientation that was hinted at that moment with the Reformed at Calvin, but really did not come to fruition for quite a while. But now in the second half of my career has been at the center of how I think about my work and scholarship as a Christian. Sorry, that was kind of long.
That was wonderful. And I really appreciated that. And you touched on a couple of themes there that are really important for our podcast. And one of those is hospitality. When you talked about ecumenical hospitality and how transformative that was. We talk a lot here about intercultural experiences and how hospitality is about giving and receiving. And in that exchange, both parties are changed, the host and the guest. And it seems to me like that's what was happening in your story. And then also, I'm just struck by the sense too of how you discovered a love for your tradition. Then you experience this hospitality, and then it's almost like you become a bridge builder to kind of translate what your tradition has to offer to the other ecumenical partners in the dialogue. And I'm sure they're doing the same thing. And that wouldn't have been possible if you hadn't had the background that you did and kind of switched and focused on Anabaptist history. So a lot of things seem to line up well to make that connection extra rich. Were you about to say something, Barney? I sense maybe you were going to ask a question there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I was. It made me think of. I know a project that I think you're working on and getting ready to work on soon, John, about the 500th year anniversary of Anabaptism, and I wonder how these experiences that you had, how they're maybe influencing what you expect this project to end up looking like, and if maybe your approach is going to be maybe somewhat unique or to what people might expect, or do you think it might be a little bit more traditional, or could you just explain a little bit more about how this project will be?
Yes, no, that's a good segue. After 36 years of teaching and other responsibilities at Goshen College, I recently announced my retirement from the faculty here. and connected with accepting a position with Menno Media, which is the publishing arm of Mennonite Church USA, to serve as project director of an initiative that they are starting called Anabaptism at 500. And the idea behind that is, as you're suggesting, in 2025, those groups who are associated with the Anabaptist tradition will have the opportunity, whether they take it or not is up to them, but the opportunity to acknowledge a 500th year birthday. If you think of the Anabaptist tradition as beginning, at least symbolically, no tradition ever begins at a moment, but symbolically, the Anabaptists sort of begin in January of 1525 with the first decision of a small group gathered in Zurich to baptize each other as adults, in some ways acknowledging or claiming that their baptism as infants was not a true baptism. And so that moment, we say, is the beginning of the Anabaptist tradition. 500 years later, seems like this is a once in every 500 year opportunity to reflect on that. And so as a historian who cares deeply about renewal and about right remembering, about thinking carefully about how we remember, this seemed like a great opportunity. And I started exploring how we have celebrated anniversaries in the past. So in 1975, at the 450th anniversary of Anabaptist beginnings, there was an impulse among Mennonites in North America to celebrate. It was a kind of a folk fest. There was a lot of emphasis on ethnic identity, on the martyr's mere. So there were a lot of plays about pioneers who had settled in these regions. There was an oratorio about the martyr's mere and an identity with this martyr tradition, and a kind of impulse to focus on the heroes of the faith. And I get that every moment has its context, but that's not the moment we're living in now. And it became clear that this should be a commemoration, but maybe not a celebration. That we commemorate, we identify beginnings, but we should do that with a certain humility, recognizing that every beginning is also a church division. And that's the flip side of renewal. One group's renewal is another group's heretics, apostasy. And so that should be part of our commemoration. We should acknowledge with gratitude the sense in which we are both Catholic and Lutheran, that we owe deep debts to the monastic tradition in the Catholic Church. I mean, when I see Amish, I think of married monastics. It is people who make a voluntary vow of whether it's baptism or the vow to enter the monastery, a disciplined life, a life committed to the difficult teachings of Jesus, a life of economic sharing, of pacifism, of distinctive nonconformity. So many elements of Amish and Hutterite life seem to reflect ideals from monasticism. The themes of Gelassenheit that are so central to the Anabaptist tradition come directly out of late medieval mysticism, of Meister Eckhart, of Johannes Tauler, and that the the best-selling book in the late 15th century was Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ, which is a kind of handbook for what it means to live an earnest, serious Christian life for ordinary people, lay people. And it has to do with, well, taking Jesus seriously. And so that emphasis in the Anabaptist tradition of a practical, lived discipleship is simply a carrying forward of themes that were deeply embedded in a strand of late medieval Catholicism. And we should we should go out of our way to thank our Catholic brothers and sisters for these elements that were nurtured in that tradition. And, you know, sola scriptura, a high view of scripture, the kind of courage that goes along with a voice of renewal that the Lutheran tradition represents. There's a lot that emphasis on grace, which we sometimes get accused of works righteousness, and yet you read the early Anabaptists, and that's not the argument they're making. They're not claiming we're saved by our good works. They're clear, it seems to me, that we receive our salvation as a gift. And that's something, you know, most of the early Anabaptists passed through a phase in which they were Lutheran before they took it one step further. So all of that is a long way of saying, sorry, my answers are long, that our commemorations should celebrate the wonderful things that are part of this tradition, but we should do it in a context of humility and of gratitude for the gifts we've received from fellow travelers in the Christian tradition.
As you were talking there about the formation of the Anabaptist tradition, how it's complex because it was a moment of renewal for those involved. But as you said before, for others, they struggled with understanding what that was. They saw it as a departure or repudiation of their own tradition. I remember reading historian Stanley Burgess in the Pentecostal charismatic tradition, who talks about renewal happening at the margins of the church. Often we find renewal at the margins. And as you were talking about this Anabaptism at 500, I was kind of sensing that the celebration in today's context needs to be sensitive to, maybe I'm reading into it, but needs to be sensitive to the margins of the church today. Like, how do we be aware of, you know, new things, new movements that are happening in other parts of the world? Like maybe now the Eurocentric American Western expression of church is having to check itself, you know, and say, maybe we're the establishment now more, and we're seeing new things as a repudiation or a threat. How do we navigate the constant renewal that keeps unfolding, you know, across the world in the Anabaptist tradition? Because my sense is that you would have a lot to say about this with your work with Mennonite World Conference and how you interact with Mennonites of other cultures and the things that are going on there. And so I'd love to hear any thoughts you have of how we appreciate and are open to the new expressions of Anabaptism in these places.
Yeah, great question. I described my encounter with the Lutherans and then later other ecumenical partners as a conversion. I think my experience with Mennonite World Conference and my deepening awareness and appreciation for the global Anabaptist tradition, actually the majority in the majority world, has also been a kind of conversion. You know, something like 40 years ago, there were about 600,000 Anabaptists in the world. In the 1970s, I guess that's 50 years ago, 600,000 Anabaptists in the world, the majority in Europe and North America. Today, there are 2.2 million Anabaptists in the world, and the overwhelming majority are in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And so in the course of my lifetime, I'm living within, this 500-year-old tradition is now in the midst of a demographic transformation. And as a historian, it seems to me we need to pay attention to this. This is really a significant shift in what it means to be part of this tradition. And so about 12 years ago, I started something basically as a result of my encounter with Mennonite World Conference and my invitation through ecumenical dialogues to be part of Mennonite World Conference, because the Lutheran dialogue, which was at a national level, moved to an international level. And so the Lutheran World Federation Mennonite World Conference engaged in a dialogue, and I was asked to be part of the Mennonite World Conference, and through that became aware of what MWC was doing. And that was the moment when I thought we have to change the way we do scholarship. So I started something called the Institute for the Study of Global Anabaptism as a way of trying to consciously redirect our academic research, scholarly focus on the dynamic that was happening in the global church, trying to make sense of what's going on there. And that includes both simply taking note, observing it. So one of the first things we did was a global Anabaptist profile. That was the first quantitative and qualitative survey of what does it mean to be an Anabaptist in the 80 other countries in which this tradition is represented. But it also means rethinking how we tell the story. And I would say the biggest challenge for me in the past decade, the way I often put it is, for many years, I taught Anabaptist history as if what God had in mind in January of 1525 was us. So you tell the story, here's the beginning, and here is the line that leads to, well, where history was always moving, which is Mennonites in North America. How did we get here? And that's a perfectly understandable way of, a genealogical path of telling your story. But once I became aware that MC USA, MC Canada, Mennonite Brethren in North America, we are now 8% of the global church. It's not how we think of ourselves. And the question for me became, how would I, as a historian, how would I have to tell the story differently if I assumed that from the very beginning, what God had in mind in January 1525 was not necessarily me, but it was this global family? How would the story look differently if that was the trajectory right from the beginning? And that takes it's unsettling. It forces you to revisit familiar assumptions. But it also, it seems to me, offers the possibility of thinking about renewal, in this case, with us as the margin. Yes, there are, the global church in some way is at the margins of our awareness, but objectively speaking, we are now at the margins, and that calls for a different kind of imagination, it seems to me, than what we're comfortable with. But it also is exciting and opens up, it seems to me, new possibilities for thinking. We'll see where it goes. I'm really pleased that the college has embraced the Institute for the Study of Global Anabaptism. I inherited a long tradition of Anabaptist scholarship at Goshen College. And I think I was a decent custodian of that tradition of Harold Bender and J.C. Wenger and John Oyer, who was my mentor. But I think that model needed to be changed. And the Institute for the Study of Global Anabaptism, I hope, is a way of offering to my successor, who's just been named, that younger person who has international experience will be able to push that forward in a fresh, new direction that I can't even see, that I haven't the imagination to see. And that fills me with such gratitude and such hope.
Yeah, it's been such a joy having you here today, and just I feel like I have to start on some homework and do a reflective paper on today's episode, because I never imagined what kind of all of this wisdom and new insight that we would gain from having you here today, John. And as my final comment, I just want to say thank you again for sharing this with us and really being such a great part of our podcast as a whole in this one episode.
It's been my pleasure, Barney. Thanks for the invitation.
I want to echo Barney's words too, and just say I really appreciated your openness about your journey and these conversion experiences that you had at various points. I think that's really helpful, and it gives me like a language or a way to think about my own personal story and inner church interactions, and it's helpful. But I also hope for our listeners today that they've also seen that sometimes in the twists and turns of our life story that there's a richer, deeper understanding we come to about the church, about God's hospitality and generosity to us through other Christians. And hopefully our listeners too will have their interest piqued in learning more about global Anabaptism and how other cultures within the Anabaptist tradition can enrich us, just as other Christian traditions can enrich our spirituality. And we want to thank you all for being here today and taking this time to listen in on our conversation. And until next time, goodbye.